Okay, this is the beginning of psychological disorders, which is modules 48 through 52. So to start off with, we have to look at what exactly is a psychological disorder. I forgot to animate my picture. Sorry. So defining a disorder, how do you define what exactly is a psychological disorder? Well, first you have to look at the patterns of thoughts and behaviors. There's patterns of thoughts and behaviors with a disorder that first of all are deviant. And what we mean by deviant is going to be they're going to be thoughts and behaviors that are quote unquote not normal. Now, what's not normal? This is deviant from normal. So what's not normal? Well, it depends upon the culture. So for example, over spring break, I went to the Field Museum recently, and my husband and I went to an exhibit that included voodoo, and it was voodoo in Haiti. Now, if you were invited to somebody's house, for example, and you were invited to somebody's house that you didn't know, and you went to their house and you saw this scenario here, this altar, they didn't really say anything about it. They're just walking through their house and you happen to see it. What would you think? Okay, here in Indiana, you'd be probably like, what the hell is going on? Who is this person? And you'd be kind of put off by it. But if it's in Haiti, that's a very common practice. It's a very common part of their culture. So it would not be considered deviant in Haiti. Other example, Sutso, and I don't know if I'm saying that right, is a common disorder in Mexico. It's this idea that children, infants particularly, are influenced by dark magic, by black magic, and they believe that this is a disorder that children can develop. Again, differences in cultures, and so culture determines partly what is deviant, what's deviant behavior, and even over time deviant behaviors become what has been deviant before is no longer deviant. It used to be, for example, that people thought that homosexuality was deviant behavior. Nowadays people disagree with that and recognize that that is not at all true. It also has to cause distress, and so you have to be distressed by it. It causes you some stress as a whole. So that was my picture for distress. But it has to cause you stress as a whole that you're not able to do some things that other people are able to do, or you're not quote unquote normal. It also has to be something that's somewhat dysfunctional. So dysfunctional meaning that it is disrupting your normal behavior. So for example, if you have a phobia, maybe you're afraid of something, right? For example, I do not like snakes, and I do not like rodents, like rats, mice, ugh. But at the same point in time, I don't like them. But it's not going to disrupt my normal behavior. So I'm not going to go out of the way to avoid a snake or a mouse or a rat. I'm going to definitely make sure I have my shoes on, okay? But my brother owns a snake. He has a snake. I've gone over to his house. He has a snake there. I can stand there and I can appreciate that he enjoys the snake, and I can watch him hold his snake, but I will not go over there. I will not touch it, okay? It's not going to go and cause me to not go and visit my brother. Okay, so it has to be deviant. So it has to be quote unquote abnormal. It has to cause you distress, and it has to be dysfunctional, disrupting your life. Okay, for something to be a psychological disorder. Now, there are two approaches to disorders. So the first approach was new at the end of the 19th century, and this was this medical model. Before this, anybody who was deemed to have some sort of psychological problem, for example, if you heard voices in the 17th century, what would they do with you? Well, at best, they put you in a sanitarium. At worst, they would kill you, right? So this medical model was just like, wait, no, these are people. We shouldn't go and, lock them away or kill them just because they hear voices. This medical model actually looked at it from the perspective of that psychological disorders there's a physical cause for it, okay, and that we should treat it. So we're going to go see those men in white coats, but they're going to do something to try and treat it rather than just lock you away. This is varied as far as their treatment. There used to be bloodletting, so they would make you bleed, and hopefully your disorder would bleed out of you. There used to be a lobotomy, where they literally drill holes in your brain, in your skull, trying to, again, let the disorder and the voices out of your head. But nowadays, the way that it's treated most often, medical model drugs. That's the most common. Another approach, however, is this biopsychosocial approach. This believes that disorders are a result of biology and people's interpretation of their environment as well as their culture. So it's kind of a three-prong approach. And we've kind of talked about this throughout this entire class, where we talked about this biopsychosocial approach. So according to this, yes, there are some things that are genetic and biological about disorders. For example, if you do a brain scan of somebody who is depressed, okay, the picture on the left is somebody who's depressed. This is a picture of somebody who's not depressed. Obviously, you can see there's a huge difference. There's been lots of testing that looks at serotonin levels for depressed people. And that's part of the reason why we have things like Prozac, okay? They're supposed to boost those neurotransmitters that hopefully help you bring out of depression. However, there is also another part to this, and the biopsychosocial approach also looks at those environmental factors. So for example, if you lose your job, for some people, that's not something that they're going to get depressed about. Some people will be like, well, hell yeah, I got free time now, or I never liked that job, I'm going to find me a better job. But for somebody who's predisposed to depression already, that's going to be an environmental factor that can go and lead to depression. And then there's that culture aspect. As a culture, we're told that you go to college, you go get a degree, you go get a job, and you make oodles of money. If you don't do that, there's something wrong with you. That's what our culture says. So as a result, it's no wonder that somebody that loses their job is predisposed to depression, and they're not doing anything with their degree. It's no wonder that they're going to develop depression. All right, last thing that I want to talk about is the DSM. The DSM is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Psychological Disorders. It is version 5, that's what the V is for. But the DSM-5 was created by the American Psychological Association, and this is the current book that is used to classify psychological disorders. In your textbook was written before 2013, so your textbook actually talks about the DSM-4. You don't need to know anything about the DSM-4. The DSM-5, the first time they're going to test on the DSM-5 is in the 2015 AP test, so don't even read about the DSM-4. I'm going to tell you about the DSM-5. So the DSM-5 is very controversial because the last time they wrote the DSM, the last update before this, the DSM-4 was written in 1994. So it's been 19 years since they'd updated it, and now that they'd updated it, what they found was there's a whole lot of changes, and it's really kind of controversial. So there's a couple things that I want to make you aware of. So some changes that you do need to know. First off, addictive disorders. So if you remember back last semester, we talked about addiction, and we talked about drug addiction. And we discussed as a class as to whether or not there are things that could be considered addictions that outside of drugs. So for example, could you be a shopping addict? Could you be a gambling addict? Could you be a sex addict? And overall, generally speaking, your textbook author basically argued no. He said that it has to be some sort of drug. Well, the DSM-5 now disagrees with him. First of all, the addiction disorders are now rated based on a severity, looking how severe your addiction is, how disruptive to your life it is, but it also now includes a gambling disorder, as well as an internet gaming disorder. Now this is controversial because there's a lot of psychologists that say, okay, wait a minute, back up. You're opening the door to all these other potential addiction disorders. So could you label somebody for all these other addictions? Um, another big change that is controversial is autism. And autism in the DSM-4, they had basically 3 different um, types that are going to be these separate disorders, okay, that under the DSM-4 were separate disorders like Asperger's and autistic disorder. The NOS, and I always forget the PDD part, but the NOS is not otherwise specified, otherwise specified. But the idea here is that for the DSM-5, they actually made it kind of like this picture is looking like. It's an umbrella disorder. So they're looking more at a spectrum. So they're looking at severe autism versus very mild or moderate autism. Now, the reason this is very controversial is because there are a lot of people that argue that under this new diagnosis and the way they are diagnosing this, there are a lot of people that would not be diagnosed as part of the autism spectrum disorder. And as a result, the question is, if they aren't diagnosed properly, will they get educational services when they go to school? So that's kind of one of the big problems with this. All right, a couple other changes you need to know. ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. This is something that used to be thought of as just a kid disorder, and you grew out of it as an adult. And you had to go and diagnose somebody before they were the age of 7. Now you can diagnose somebody before the age of, I think, 12 or 14, I can't remember. So the age is increased, but they've also recognized that ADHD can also happen as an adult and continue as an adult. So this is looking at some of the symptoms of ADHD and how it looks as a kid and then how it looks as an adult. So that hyperactivity component that as a kid they couldn't sit still, they're constantly running around, climbing things at inappropriate times. As an adult, they're not going to be doing that, but they're going to be restless. They can't stay focused on one thing. They're fidgety, they're impatient. Okay? As a kid, they will be physically impulsive, so they'll do things that may result in injuries, but as an adult, they're going to be verbally impulsive. Their inattention still stays the same, but the point is that in order for a continued diagnosis of ADHD, they require less symptoms after the age of 16. OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, and PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, are now separated from anxiety disorders. They used to be lumped together as a kind of an anxiety disorder family. Now it's looked at as those are separated from anxiety. They recognize the differences between them, but they're still kind of in the same chapter, you might say. They also included hoarding now, if you've ever watched any of those hoarding shows. Hoarding is now included as an OCD-related disorder, which is interesting because a lot of people think of hoarding as like on those hoarding TV shows where it's just this giant mess and there's like dead cats in there and stuff. It's disgusting. But hoarding can also look like this, where it's very nice and well organized. But keep in mind that hoarding is an obsession and it's a compulsion. You have to go and collect more of these things, right? It's an obsession where you're constantly looking for more of whatever it is, okay? So that's why it's an OCD disorder now. Bipolar is also separated from depression. It used to be included under the broad category of mood disorders. Now bipolar and depression are separated. And bereavement. Bereavement is when you lose somebody, right? You suffer a loss, a death. And it used to be that was not included as you couldn't be diagnosed with depression if you suffered from bereavement. They just said, oh, you just lost someone, you're going through the grieving process. Well, now they actually say that just because they're grieving doesn't mean that they couldn't have depression. So that's also a change in there. And then lastly, schizophrenia. Schizophrenia subtypes were removed. They used to have subtypes. They had paranoid schizophrenic, disorganized schizophrenic, catatonic schizophrenic, but now they've gotten rid of those because pretty much they didn't have enough evidence to be able to support the differentiation between the types. So they got rid of those. All right, those are the major things that you need to know about the DSM-5. Let me know if you have any questions.